Picture this. It's the summer of 1944, and a group of U.S. Marines is crouched around a wrecked Japanese tank on a dusty, sun-baked stretch of Pacific Island. The thing is small, embarrassingly small. A person of average height can look directly over the top of the turret without standing on their toes. These men have been fighting for days. They're exhausted. Their buddies are dead, and they're standing here looking at this machine that was supposed to be a serious threat. One of them pulls his fist back and punches it clean through a hole in the armor. A hole made by a machine gun bullet, not an artillery shell, not a dedicated anti-tank round. A machine gun bullet. The Marines look at each other, and in that moment, something clicks. They realize that the weapon they'd been using to knock down planes and shred trucks, that big bellowing 50 caliber Browning they'd had bolted to half-tracks and foxhole mounts, had been punching right through Japanese armor all along. Not because it was designed to kill tanks. It wasn't. It just turned out that Japan had been sending its tankers to war inside machines that a heavy machine gun could eat alive. That realization changed the psychological calculus of the entire Pacific War for the Marines, who survived the night of June 17th, 1944. And for the Japanese tankers who didn't, it was the last thing many of them ever understood. This is the story of the Hago, the men who built it, the men who drove it, and the night a massive armored assault dissolved into a killing field because of a weapon originally designed to shoot down airplanes. The machine that conquered Asia. To understand why the Hago's destruction was so psychologically devastating, you first have to understand what it meant to the men inside it. The Type 95 Hago light tank was not some rushed, desperate design. It was the product of careful engineering by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, developed over several years in the early 1930s, and it was genuinely good at what it was designed to do. In 1933, the Imperial Japanese Army identified a real problem. Its existing main tank, the Type 89 medium tank, could only manage about 24 kilometers per hour on a good road. That was fine for walking beside infantry, but the Army was watching other nations develop motorized units where troops rode in trucks doing 64 kilometers per hour. If Japanese infantry was going to keep pace in a modern war, it needed a tank that could actually keep up with them. The Army Technical Bureau set strict specifications. The new tank had to weigh around 7 tons, mount a 37mm gun, reach 40 kilometers per hour, and have armor capable of stopping rifle and machine gun bullets. It had to be simple, easy to build, and easy to fix in the field. Engineer Tomio Ohara, who had already made his name designing the Type 89, took the contract. His signature contribution was the bell crank suspension system, a design elegant enough that it became the standard layout for Japanese tanks for the next decade. By June 1934, Mitsubishi had the first prototype running. When it went through field trials in Manchuria and on Japanese proving grounds, observers were impressed. It hit 45 kilometers per hour on paved roads and held 25 to 30 kilometers per hour across rough terrain. The suspension absorbed punishment that stopped other vehicles cold. The 6-cylinder Mitsubishi diesel engine, a point of genuine pride for Japanese engineers, produced 120 horsepower, was less likely to catch fire than gasoline engines, and gave the tank a combat range of roughly 209 kilometers. By the standards of 1934, this was a capable little machine. Testing did expose problems, though. On rough ground, the suspension bucked violently enough to make aimed fire while moving nearly impossible, and it shook the crew so badly that extended operations were genuinely punishing. Engineers partially solved this by adding braces connecting pairs of bogie wheels, a fix that became known as the Manchurian suspension. It helped, it never fully fixed the problem. When the design went before the Army Technical Bureau in 1935 for formal adoption, the infantry side pushed back. 12 millimeters of armor, they argued, wasn't enough to shield infantry support operations against fortified positions. The cavalry side countered that mobility and firepower compensated for thin protection, and the tank's role was exploitation and support, not taking direct fire. After heated debate, infantry accepted the compromise. The Type 95 light tank was officially adopted, its name derived from the Japanese imperial calendar, specifically the 2595th year since Japan's legendary founding. Production began in 1936. In its dimensions, the finished tank was a small, almost delicate-looking thing, 4.38 meters long, 2.06 meters wide, and 2.13 meters high. It weighed 7.4 tons unloaded, climbing to about 8.1 tons fully crewed, fueled, and armed. The armor was exactly as thin as... Critics feared 12 millimeters at its thickest on the turret and upper hull, 9 millimeters on the top and bottom plates, and only 6 millimeters on some secondary surfaces. Japanese designers calculated this was sufficient to stop rifle bullets and light machine gun rounds at combat distances. Given their expected opponents at the time, Chinese forces with few anti-tank weapons and the light Soviet tanks they might face in Manchuria, that calculation wasn't unreasonable. The three-man crew lived in extraordinary cramped conditions. The driver sat in the front left of the hull, watching the world through a tiny periscope and a small vision port. To his right sat the hull machine gunner, wedged into a cubicle barely large enough to operate the Type 97 7.7 millimeter machine gun. In the turret above, alone, standing throughout all combat because there was no seat, stood the commander. His job description was insane by the standards of any other army. He had to command the vehicle, guide the driver with voice and hand signals, communicate with other tanks through visual signals when no radio was present, and only 1 in 4 tanks even had a radio. Operate the main 37 millimeter gun, load the main gun himself in the cramped standing position, and also manage a rear-facing machine gun at the back of the turret. American tankers who later examined captured Hagos were genuinely astonished that any human being could function effectively inside one under fire. The victories that bred a fatal confidence. Starting in 1937, the Hago went to war, and for years it won. The Chinese Nationalist Army had almost no tanks of its own and extremely limited anti-tank capability. Against Chinese infantry, the Hago was devastating. Its 37 millimeter gun shredded fortifications and suppressed troops in the open. Its machine guns cut down soldiers attempting to flee across flat ground. Its mobility let it exploit breakthroughs and chase retreating units in ways that pure infantry never could. Japanese tankers accumulated victories and confidence in roughly equal measure. They were lords of the battlefield in China, moving through terrain others said was impassable, breaking lines that had held against repeated infantry assaults. The Hago didn't just win in China, it won easily. It dominated. In 1939, at the Battle of Khalkhin Gol on the Mongolian border, known to the Japanese as the Nomonhan Incident, the Hago met a real opponent for the first time. Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks carried 45 millimeter guns with stronger armor-penetrating capability than the Japanese 37 millimeter, and Soviet armor was noticeably thicker. The battle was a serious defeat for Japan overall, and the tankers came away shaken. But the lessons learned at Nomonhan were not fully absorbed. The war in China resumed its overwhelming one-sidedness, and by 1941, when Japan went to war across the Pacific, the men climbing into Hagos carried the confidence of years of easy victory, not the caution that a hard fight with the Soviets should have instilled. In December 1941, Hago tanks moved through rubber plantations and jungle tracks in Malaya, following the Japanese advance towards Singapore along routes that British commanders had confidently declared impassable for armored vehicles. The British had deployed almost no armor in Malaya, and the Hago's mobility through terrain that was supposed to be tank-proof became one of the decisive tactical factors in one of the most complete military collapses in British history. In the Philippines, on December 22, 1941, near De Mortis on the Bataan Peninsula, Type 95 tanks engaged American M3 Stuart light tanks in what was recorded as the first tank-on-tank battle for U.S. forces in the Pacific. Both vehicles carried 37 mm guns. The Stuart had significantly better armor, 32 mm on the turret sides versus the Hago's 12 mm. But the Japanese crews reacted first, destroyed the lead Stuart, and drove off the rest. Another easy victory. From the perspective of Japanese tank crews, the Hago's record was essentially flawless. It had performed perfectly against the Chinese, held its own against the Americans in the Philippines, and rolled through terrain that gave every other army fits. The fact that it was a mid-1930s design with paper-thin armor seemed irrelevant. It worked. The men who drove it trusted it. Their commanders committed it. What none of them fully reckoned with was the difference between fighting opponents who lacked effective anti-tank weapons and fighting an opponent who had built an industrial machine specifically designed to produce modern weapons at a scale Japan could not begin to match. Saipan, the island that could change everything. By June 1944, the Pacific War had been grinding for nearly 3 years. The Japanese strategy had depended on seizing a vast defensive perimeter and holding it long enough to make the cost of fighting through it prohibitive for the Americans. Island by island, that perimeter had been cracked. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, the Marshalls. The Americans kept coming, kept landing, kept grinding forward. Saipan was different from all of it. The island sits in the Mariana Chain, roughly 2,000 kilometers from Tokyo. Its airfields in American hands would put the new B-29 Superfortress bombers within reach of the Japanese home islands. This wasn't a strategic inconvenience. This was an existential threat. The Japanese Imperial War Council had designated the Marianas as part of the absolute national defense zone, ground to be held at literally any cost. Emperor Hirohito himself recognized that losing Saipan meant Tokyo would eventually burn. The Japanese had fortified accordingly. Approximately 30,000 troops defended Saipan, nearly double what American intelligence estimated. Among them was the 9th Tank Regiment, commanded by Colonel Hideki Goto, equipped with the largest armored force Japan had assembled in the Pacific. 44 tanks, a mix of Type 95 Hagos and the slightly larger Type 97 Chiha medium tanks, the latter carrying a 57 mm gun. By Pacific theater standards, this was a formidable armored formation. Nothing the Marines had faced before came close to it. Operation Forager, the American invasion of the Marianas, launched on June 15, 1944. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner ordered the assault force ashore, and by 8:40 that morning, The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions were hitting the beaches on Saipan's western coast. Japanese artillery and mortar fire from the high ground above the beaches was intense. The Marines pushed inland against fierce resistance, taking brutal casualties. By nightfall, 20,000 American combat troops were ashore, with M4 Sherman medium tanks being unloaded from LSTs to support the infantry. The beachhead was established, but it was not yet secure. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, commanding the Japanese defense, understood exactly what was at stake. Every hour the Americans stayed ashore and organized themselves, the harder they would be to dislodge. June 16th was spent consolidating the beachhead while Japanese artillery continued to pound the beaches. By nightfall of the 16th, Saito made the decision that would define the battle. He ordered a massive counterattack. The plan was specific. The infantry of the 136th Regiment would attack American positions around Sharan-Kanoa Airfield. The 9th Tank Regiment, every tank Goto had, would advance from Hill 164.6, wait for the infantry attack to begin, then charge the radio station area, smashing through the Marine lines in a single overwhelming thrust. It was an ambitious plan, a bold plan. And for Colonel Goto and his tankers climbing into their vehicles in the darkness before dawn on June 17th, it felt like an entirely achievable one. The night the steel shield failed. Shortly before 3:30 in the morning on June 17th, Colonel Goto opened the hatch of his Type 97 command tank, stood erect in the open turret, and waved his cavalry saber over his head. His junior commanders, following his lead, did the same, a ceremonial gesture rooted in cavalry tradition, the officer visible to his men before the charge. One by one, they slapped the sides of their tanks with their sabers. Metal rang on metal in the night air. Then hatches closed, engines roared, the column moved. The Marines heard them before they saw them. Sentries on the line reported engine noise from the north. Not one engine, but dozens. A growing mechanical thunder carried on the pre-dawn air. Officers shouted for weapons and positions. Anti-tank gun crews traversed their 37-millimeter guns toward the sound. Sherman crews scrambled into their vehicles and cranked up their engines. Machine gun teams checked ammunition belts and adjusted their sights. U.S. Navy ships offshore were asked for illumination rounds. When those star shells burst over the Tanapag Plain, they lit the scene in a cold, flickering white light. And what the Marines saw was a column of Japanese tanks, dark shapes clattering forward out of the gloom, some with infantry clinging to the hulls, moving at speed toward the Marine positions. The largest Japanese armored assault of the Pacific War was rolling directly at them. Marine riflemen and anti-tank gunners began engaging. The 37-millimeter anti-tank guns sent rounds downrange. Bazookas, the newly deployed M1A1 rocket launcher, punched through the first tanks that reached the line. But it was the machine guns that told the story of the night in ways nobody had quite anticipated. Browning M2 heavy machine guns had been placed throughout the Marine defensive positions, mounted on half-tracks, and in fixed positions on the line. These were not infantry machine guns. The standard infantry weapon was a 7.62 millimeter weapon, useful against personnel, not armor. The M2 was a different beast entirely. It fired a 12.7 millimeter round, the famous .50 caliber, at a muzzle velocity of around 880 meters per second. It had been designed in the final stages of the First World War, when General John Pershing requested something that could kill armored aircraft and pierce light armored vehicles. Its armor-piercing rounds could punch through 23 millimeters of face-hardened steel plate at 200 meters. The Hago's thickest armor was 12 millimeters. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. The M2's AP rounds could penetrate nearly twice the Hago's maximum armor thickness at the distances these tanks were charging. As they surged forward in the dark, they were running into a wall of fire that their armor was physically incapable of stopping. Marine machine gunners who had never expected their weapons to function as anti-tank guns found their tracers punching clean through the frontal armor of charging Hagos, entering one side and exiting the other, or fragmenting inside the hull in a storm of shrapnel. One gunner firing from near the airfield watched his rounds hit a Hago driving straight at him, saw sparks visible through the tank's vision ports as the bullets ricocheted around inside the crew compartment, watched the tank slow and stop as smoke poured from the engine. Another, firing from a half-track at roughly 150 meters, held his trigger down on a Hago's flank and watched the commander in the turret collapse, bullets having passed cleanly through the turret wall. A third Marine, targeting the rear engine deck with its 6mm armor covering the cooling vents, watched his rounds punch into the diesel engine and seize it solid. Inside the Japanese tanks, the experience was something for which no training had prepared the crews. Their armor had always been their protection, the fundamental guarantee that had made armored warfare worthwhile. In China, in Malaya, in the Philippines, small arms fire had been noise. Bullets hit the outside of the tank and stayed there. Now they were coming through. Bullets were inside the tanks with the crews, in a vehicle as cramped as the Hago, with the commander standing unsupported in a turret barely a meter across. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The thin steel walls that were supposed to protect them had become a prison. Then the Shermans appeared. The M4A2 Shermans that the 2nd Marine Tank Battalion had brought ashore weighed just over 31 tons. They carried 51 millimeters of frontal hull armor, sloped at 56 degrees, an arrangement that gave them effective protection equivalent to about 75 millimeters against incoming fire. Their main armament was a 75 millimeter gun capable of penetrating Hago armor from over 1,600 meters away. When they rolled forward and opened fire on the Japanese tank column, it wasn't a duel, it was execution. 75 millimeter armor-piercing rounds, and in the Pacific, the Marines often used high-explosive rounds because AP tended to punch straight through Japanese tanks without detonating, hit Hagos and Type 97s, and simply destroyed them. Turrets were blasted clear off hulls. Ammunition stacked loosely in fighting compartments detonated. Tanks turned into burning pyres that lit the battlefield for hundreds of meters in every direction, illuminating their surviving companions still trying to push forward. The Japanese tanks returned fire. Their 37 millimeter guns and the 57 millimeter guns on the Type 97s hit Shermans repeatedly. The rounds bounced off. They left marks. They did not penetrate. One Hago commander, his tank disabled by 50 caliber fire but his turret still rotating, ordered his gunner to fire a 37 millimeter armor-piercing round directly into the front of a Sherman turret at close range. The Sherman didn't slow down. It rotated its turret with mechanical calm, aimed and fired a single 75 millimeter shell that turned the Hago into a fireball. By morning, it was over. The reckoning. Walking among the wreckage. When dawn broke on June 17, 1944, the battlefield on the Tanapag Plain was littered with destroyed Japanese tanks. Some sources count 31 tanks destroyed in the direct fighting. Others, accounting for vehicles knocked out by artillery at the perimeter, put the number as high as 35. Around 1,000 Japanese soldiers were dead, including most of the tank crews and the infantry that had ridden to battle clinging to the hulls. Colonel Goto's Ninth Tank Regiment had been shattered in a few hours of darkness. The commander of the 2nd Marine Division, reflecting on the battle afterward, admitted that if the Japanese attack had succeeded, if it had punched through the Marine lines and rolled up the beachhead, it would have been catastrophic for the division's fighting effectiveness. The night had been genuinely dangerous. The cost was real, and the fighting was savage in both directions. Japanese infantry had actually breached the Marine perimeter in places, fighting hand-to-hand in foxholes. One Marine reported lying flat in his position as a Hago rolled directly over it, drenching him in oil from the leaking engine, staying motionless until the tank passed, then crawling out and throwing a thermite grenade into the engine compartment from behind. Another jammed a coconut log into the bogie wheels to stop a tank, then jumped on it and dropped a grenade through the open turret hatch when the confused commander emerged to investigate. But when the fighting stopped and the Marines walked among the destroyed tanks in the morning light, a different truth emerged. Marine officers called their men over to examine the Hagos, pointing to the holes in the armor. Not ragged craters from anti-tank guns or artillery. Round, relatively clean holes punched by 50 caliber machine gun rounds. The exit holes on the far side were larger, edges torn outward where the bullet had passed through the interior and kept going. Some holes wide enough to fit a fist through. One Marine reportedly stared at a Hago for a long time before saying something to the effect that the Japanese had been sending their men to fight inside tin cans. He wasn't wrong. By Pacific War standards, the Hago had always looked formidable. On Guadalcanal in 1942, the Marines, poorly equipped, undergunned, fighting for their lives, had looked at these same tanks with genuine fear. Now, with Shermans and bazookas and 50 caliber machine guns, the Hago looked like what it actually was, a 1930s light tank designed to fight enemies who couldn't shoot back effectively. For the Japanese tankers who survived, those whose tanks were disabled, but who lived, those who were captured, the psychological shock was reported consistently by American intelligence officers conducting interrogations. One captured tank officer stated that his first reaction to machine gun fire penetrating his tank was that the Americans must have developed a secret weapon, some new specialized ammunition, some advanced gun that merely looked like a standard heavy machine gun, but fired rounds with properties no conventional weapon possessed. He could not accept that an ordinary 50 caliber Browning had defeated his tank's armor. In his entire experience from training in Manchuria to years of combat in China, small arms fire had never come through. It had always been noise on the outside. Now it was inside with him. The trap that was always there. Here is the quietly devastating thing about what happened on Saipan. It wasn't a surprise to American ordnance engineers. The fact that M2 Browning armor-piercing rounds could penetrate the Hago's 12mm armor wasn't a battlefield discovery. It was something that could have been calculated at a desk with nothing more than published ballistic data. The M2 Browning had been designed with armor penetration as a core requirement. General Pershing's original specification in 1917 called for a weapon capable of defeating armored aircraft and light vehicles. The round that Winchester developed aided significantly by the capture of German 13.2 millimeter anti-tank rifle ammunition, was designed specifically to pierce steel. By wartime testing, the M2's armor-piercing rounds penetrated 23 millimeters of face-hardened steel at 200 meters and still managed 19 millimeters at 500 meters. The Hago's thickest armor, 12 millimeters, was not even close to the M2's capability at any combat distance. The Japanese Army General Staff actually knew this at some level. A 1938 intelligence assessment noted that the Hago's thin armor made it vulnerable to heavy machine gun fire. The Army began development of a replacement, the Type 98 Caney light tank, specifically designed to address this vulnerability. The Caney had thicker armor and better fighting conditions for the crew. It entered production in 1942. About 200 were built. They were absorbed into garrison and training roles. They never reached Saipan. They never reached most of the Pacific battlefields where the Hago kept going to war and dying. The reason comes back to the same industrial reality that shaped every aspect of the Pacific War. Japan was not making strategic choices about tank armor out of ignorance. It was making choices out of constraint. The Navy had first call on Japan's steel, its engineering talent, and its manufacturing capacity. Warships and aircraft came before tanks, always. By the time the full implications of the Pacific War's industrial demands were clear, Japanese factories were already strained past what they could sustainably produce. American submarines were cutting off the flow of raw materials from Southeast Asia. The Army's tank program competed for resources against the kamikaze aircraft programs and the coastal defense guns being stockpiled for the anticipated Allied invasion of the home islands. Tanks were a low priority. The tankers paid for that choice in the dark on Saipan. The factory floor that won the war. The gap between American and Japanese armor in the Pacific was not just a gap in design philosophy. It was a gap in what two different industrial economies were capable of producing. Mitsubishi and its manufacturing partners built approximately 2,300 Type 95 Hagos across the entire production run from 1936 to 1943. That was Japan's full output of its primary light tank across 7 years of production by multiple facilities. American factories during the same war produced 49,234 M4 Shermans. The Detroit Tank Arsenal, built by Chrysler in Warren, Michigan, sat on 567 acres and covered over 1.5 million square feet of production space. It operated 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In December 1942 alone, that single facility produced 97 Sherman tanks, more than Japan produced in an entire year. The Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, built over 11,000 Shermans. The American Locomotive Company in Schenectady, New York, a locomotive manufacturer retooled for tank production, contributed 2,300 more. The Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia added over 1,200. Pacific Car and Foundry in Washington. State Pressed Steel Car Company in Pennsylvania. Pullman Standard Car Manufacturing in Illinois. Federal Machine and Welder in Ohio. 10 major manufacturers, plus thousands of subcontractors producing engines, radios, optics, tracks, weapons, and components. The workforce included hundreds of thousands of women who had never worked in heavy industry before the war, now welding armor plate, assembling turrets, and installing engines. The real-life embodiment of the Rosie the Riveter image that the war would canonize. They proved that a nation could multiply its industrial output by including the half of its population that peacetime manufacturing had excluded. The Sherman that resulted from all this production was not a perfect tank. Its gun was inferior to the German Tiger and Panther. In Europe, American tankers paid a horrific price fighting up-armored German machines with a tank that had been deliberately designed for mass production rather than maximum battlefield performance. But in the Pacific, against tanks designed in the mid-1930s with 12 millimeters of armor, the Sherman was not just competitive. It was overwhelming. Its frontal armor was 4 times the thickness of the Hagos. Its gun could penetrate Hago armor from over a mile away. Its 5-man crew, each with a specific trained role, operated in over 4.2 cubic meters of workspace, compared to the Hago's 3 men crammed into roughly 2 cubic meters, one of them standing the entire time with no seat. Every Sherman had a radio. 1 in 4 Hagos had one. The Sherman had a gyro-stabilized main gun that could fire while moving. The Hago's turret was rotated by hand crank. The comparison wasn't between a good tank and a mediocre one. It was between 2 different eras of industrial warfare. The pattern repeated everywhere they went. Saipan was not an isolated event. It was the clearest demonstration of a pattern that then repeated itself across every island where Japanese tanks appeared for the rest of the war. On Tinian in July 1944, the next Mariana Island in the American advance, 7 Type 95s launched a counterattack against Marine positions and were destroyed within minutes. On Peleliu in September 1944, Japanese commanders recognized the futility of mobile tank warfare against American firepower and ordered their Hagos, buried in caves, to be used as stationary armored pillboxes. It didn't help much. 50 caliber machine guns still penetrated turret armor. Flamethrower tanks could spray napalm through vision ports and open hatches, burning the crew alive in their immobile steel boxes. Bazookas punched through the thin armor from any angle. On Iwo Jima in February 1945, Baron Nishi's 26th Tank Regiment buried their tanks in volcanic ash with only turrets exposed, using them as hardened defensive positions. They were picked apart by the 3 full American tank battalions landing on that island, the most concentrated armor the Marines had yet assembled, along with flamethrowers and satchel charges. Even the dignity of a fighting death in mobile combat was gone. Japanese tanks had become defensive furniture, waiting to be destroyed rather than striking to destroy. At Okinawa, the last major island campaign of the Pacific War, Japan committed the 27th Tank Regiment with 27 tanks total, 13 Hagos, and 14 Type 97s. The Americans landed with over 800 tanks. The disparity was not just numerical, it was categorical. When Japanese tanks sortied in the May 1945 counteroffensive, they were destroyed within hours by a combination of Sherman tanks, bazookas, 37mm anti-tank guns, artillery, and 50 caliber machine guns. The same weapon that had destroyed them on Saipan, the same result on a different island a year later. Japan did eventually design better tanks. The Type 3 Chi-Nu medium tank, carrying a 75mm gun, was a real improvement. The Type 4 Chaito was more formidable still, but the Type 3 saw only 166 units built across the entire war, and the Type 4 never reached combat. Both were held on the Japanese home islands for the expected Allied invasion that never came in the form Japan's planners imagined. On Saipan, on Peleliu, on Iwo Jima, on Okinawa, Japanese tankers fought and died in machines their own engineers had already acknowledged were inadequate. What Saipan meant, the fall of Saipan had consequences that extended far beyond any battlefield. Emperor Hirohito, upon receiving news that Saipan could not be held, acknowledged for the first time that the war was not proceeding as promised. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had led Japan into the Pacific War and had staked his government's prestige on delivering victory, resigned on July 18, 1944, the direct political casualty of Saipan's fall. The Japanese government allowed its media to admit, for the first time, that the war was going poorly. The psychological shock to the Japanese home front was severe for Marine commanders throughout the Pacific. The lessons of June 17th spread quickly through military channels. Intelligence reports summarize the consistent pattern in captured Japanese tanker statements. Shock at American firepower, disbelief at the quantity and quality of American equipment, a sense of betrayal that their leaders had sent them into battle against an opponent they were categorically unprepared to face. Japanese tanks were not a serious threat. Standard infantry heavy weapons, particularly the .50 caliber Browning, were effective against them. Combined with bazookas, 37mm anti-tank guns, and Shermans, the Marines possessed completely overwhelming capability against Japanese armor. One veteran Japanese tank commander who had been fighting since 1937 told American interrogators that he had believed Japan would win the war through superior fighting spirit and loyalty to the emperor. After Saipan, after watching his tanks torn open by machine gun fire, after watching his 37mm shells bounce harmlessly off Sherman armor, he said simply that spirit could not overcome material reality, that the gap between what Japan could build and what America could build was not a gap in fighting will. It was a gap in industrial civilization. He was right, and he knew it. And that knowledge, for a man who had built his professional life around armored warfare, must have been devastating in a way that no external wound could match. The Hago's legacy. In the years after the war, several surviving Hagos were shipped to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland for detailed examination. American engineers measured every surface, analyzed the metallurgy, photographed every corner of the interior. The armor was face-hardened steel, a technique that made the outer surface harder to crack than the interior, effective against small arms fire, but unable to resist larger projectiles with enough energy to break through the hard outer layer. The maximum armor thickness confirmed at 12 millimeters. The fighting compartment confirmed as providing less than 1.4 cubic meters of space for the commander. The turret ring measured at only 1,200 millimeters in diameter. The vision devices described as crude, the fire controls as primitive, but the crew conditions as cramped to the point of being operationally compromising even without enemy fire. Their reports didn't condemn the Hago as a bad design. They condemned it as a design built for a world that no longer existed by the time it reached Saipan. Against enemies who lacked serious anti-tank weapons, the Hago was genuinely capable, fast, reliable, mechanically solid, able to traverse terrain that stopped other vehicles. It was exactly what Japan had asked for in 1933, built exactly as specified. The problem was that Japan had gone on fighting in 1944 with a 1933 answer to a 1944 question. Today, about 15 Type 95 Hagos survive in museums around the world. One is at the National Museum of the Pacific War in City, Fredericksburg, Texas. There are examples at U.S. Army museums, at the Australian War Memorial, at displays across Southeast Asia where these machines once rolled. They're small in person, startlingly small to modern eyes, accustomed to the scale of Cold War and post-Cold War armor. Standing next to one, you understand immediately why a Marine could look over the top of the turret. You understand why a 50 caliber round went straight through. What you have to work harder to understand is what it felt like to climb inside one in the early morning hours of June 17th, 1944, in the dark, and drive it toward an enemy line you couldn't see. To believe, as those men believed based on everything their training and experience had told them, that the steel around you would keep you safe. To discover, in the last moments of your life, that it wouldn't. The Marines who walked among the wreckage that morning understood something important. Wars are not decided by the bravery of the men inside, the machines. Bravery was not in short supply on either side in the Pacific. Wars are decided by the machines themselves, by the factories that built them, the decisions that designed them, the industrial economies that produced them at scale. Japan had brave men. Japan had skilled engineers. Japan had tanks. What Japan didn't have and couldn't have was the Detroit tank arsenal running 3 shifts a day, producing 97 Shermans in a single month. That arithmetic, written in orange tracer fire across the Tanapag Plain in the pre-dawn dark, was the real lesson of Saipan. It was a lesson in what industrial civilization actually means when it goes to war. If you found this story as gripping as I did, make sure you hit that like button. It genuinely helps other people find content like this. Subscribe to WW2 Tales if you haven't already, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. There are so many stories from this war that deserve to be told in detail, and we're only getting started.